Let me say plainly, Cuba is next. For decades, the communist regime in Havana has survived on three things: repression at home in Cuba, useful idiots abroad, and foreign patrons willing to keep the Cuban lights on. First, it was the Soviet Union, then Venezuela, then increasingly it was China, Russia, Iran, and every anti-Western network looking for a foothold 90 miles from Florida. And who has cheered this on from South Africa? The moronic ANC, of course. The ANC has never met a failed socialist experiment it didn't want to kiss, fund, excuse, or defend. They call Cuba a friend. They call it a model. They call it solidarity. I call it what it is: a collapsing communist police state that has impoverished its people while its ruling elite clings to power. Now, the whole thing is wobbling, and Donald Trump knows it. Watch that space. The big signal came recently. The United States Department of Justice unsealed an indictment against Raul Castro, accusing him in connection with the 1996 shoot-down of two brothers in a rescue aircraft. That attack killed 4 volunteers, including 3 American citizens, and it is sat for 30 years as one of those kind of grotesque Cold War crimes the polite diplomatic corps prefers to file away and forget. But Trump has not forgotten. Marco Rubio, who's superb, has not forgotten. And the Cuban people have not forgotten either. This is not just an indictment. This is a message. It says to the old Castro elite, your immunity is over. Your revolutionary mythology is over. Your "we are untouchable" act is over. You can be named, you can be charged, and you can be isolated. And if the Maduro precedent tells us anything, you can be physically brought before American justice. And this is why this matters. The old foreign policy establishment would say, don't provoke Havana. Do not push too hard. Keep talking. Keep managing decline. Well, the rules have changed. Trump looks at the same problem and says, no, we're done managing hostile regimes in our own hemisphere. This is the Maduro playbook being applied to Cuba. Watch this space. Legal pressure, sanctions, energy pressure, naval presence, blockade, direct communication to the people over the heads of the regime, humanitarian offers that bypass the military business mafia in Cuba, and a public declaration that America is not against the Cuban people. America is against the gang that has held them hostage since 1959. And that distinction is crucial because the Cuban regime has always hidden behind the suffering of its own people. It says, look what sanctions have done to you. But who built the system that cannot feed itself? Who built the hospitals that cannot function without fuel? Who built the currency disaster, the surveillance state, the dead economy, the ration books, the empty shelves, the exodus of young talent? Not America. America didn't build that. Communism built that. And now that the humanitarian situation is in a really bad state, I mean, it's appalling. The United Nations is warning that hospitals across Cuba are suspending surgeries, struggling to run life-saving equipment, and facing severe medicine and medical shortages. And in some areas of Cuba, blackouts, which we know from South Africa thanks to the ANC, but in Cuba they're lasting up to 20 hours. More than 100,000 patients, including 11,000 children, are waiting for delayed surgeries. 5 million people who have chronic illnesses face interruptions to get to life-saving equipment. And this isn't a functioning country. This is not revolutionary dignity. This is a state in terminal decay. It is where South Africa is heading under the ANC. And here is the strategic genius of the Trump approach. He's not just tightening the screws. He's offering a way out to the Cuban people. Reports from the Atlantic Council note that the administration has paired pressure on the regime with a standing offer of $100 million in immediate aid for food and medicine, provided it is distributed by a trusted charity like the Catholic Church, rather than by the Cuban government or GAESA, which is the military conglomerate that dominates the island's economy, GAESA. So, in other words, aid for the people, pressure on the regime, and that is Trump's method. And that is exactly the right formula. Because if you give aid to the Cuban state, you're sort of feeding the jailers. You're perpetuating the problem. And if you route aid through an independent civil society, you feed the prisoners. And that's the moral line that Trump and Rubio are drawing. Now step back and look at the bigger map. Venezuela has already been hit. Clinically, professionally, the new American style. Maduro's removal changed the strategic weather across Latin America. For years, Venezuela's oil, intelligence links, and criminal network helped keep Havana alive. But you cut that lifeline, and Cuba loses not only fuel, but also confidence. Then look to Colombia, Panama, the Caribbean, and the wider hemisphere, the Western Hemisphere. And the message is unmistakable. The Monroe Doctrine is back, but in Trump language, so it's kind of the Monroe Doctrine. No Chinese forward base in the Caribbean. Basta. No Russian intelligence platform 90 miles from Florida. No Russian listening facilities. No Iranian proxy routes through Latin America. No communist narco-state network operating under the protection of old diplomatic habits. This is not nostalgia. This is geopolitics, Trump style. And it connects directly to China. Trump's recent China visit was not some empty photo opportunity. Whatever the left-wing and usual mainstream media callers tell you, the White House says Trump and Xi agreed on a framework for global strategic stability, new boards of trade and investment, critical mineral discussions, Boeing purchases, agricultural commitments, beef access, poultry access, and even common ground in Iran and North Korea. They didn't need a signing ceremony. But of course, we've got to be realistic. The Council on Foreign Relations described the summit as heavier on symbolism than substance, and warned that the structural problems with China remain: rare earths, tariffs, export controls, Taiwan technology, and supply chain vulnerability. Fine. But symbolism actually does matter. Power is often the art of making the other side stand in the room and acknowledge the hierarchy. Xi did not meet a weak American president begging for accommodation. He met a president who's reasserting American primacy from Beijing to Caracas to Havana. This is the big story. Trump is winning and America is leading again. And when America leads, the rats start moving. The Cuban elite will now be doing the calculation every failing regime actually does. Who is safe? Who has a plane? Who has a passport? Who has dollars offshore? Who can cut a deal? Who gets sanctioned next? Who gets indicted next? Who gets blamed when the lights finally go out? That is how regimes fall. Not usually in one Hollywood moment, but in the quiet panic inside the palace in Havana. The colonel stops taking calls. The banker moves money. The son-in-law leaves for Madrid. The minister suddenly discovers his love of reform. The police commander hesitates before shooting protesters because he is no longer sure Washington is bluffing. That is the psychological break Trump is creating. And South Africans should pay close attention, particularly the ANC, because the ANC's loyalty to Cuba tells you everything about those morons. They didn't align themselves with Singapore, Switzerland, Israel, South Korea, or any high-performance society that builds wealth and competence. They aligned themselves emotionally and ideologically with Havana, Moscow, Tehran, and the loser caucus of world politics. So when Cuba falls, and it will, and I believe it's closer than people think, the ANC loses more than an ally. It loses a symbol. It loses one of the last romantic myths of global socialism. It loses the argument that revolutionary movements can govern modern economics. It loses the fantasy that anti-Americanism is a strategy. Because anti-Americanism is not a strategy, it's a tantrum. And tantrums don't build ports, power stations, semiconductor supply chains, functioning hospitals, or credible currencies. Trump understands something the Davos WEF crowd never understood. Peace comes when enemies face consequences, allies come with commitments, and the world and actors because there is a sheriff in town again. Cuba's feeling that. The Castro-era is being dragged out of the museum and into the courtroom, and the regime is being cut off from its lifelines. The people are being spoken to directly. The elite are being told the deal is changing. So yes, I'm going to say it again. Regime change is coming to Cuba. Maybe not tomorrow morning. Maybe not in the neat, tidy, think tank way people draw on a whiteboard, but the process has begun. The old order is out of money, out of electricity, out of legitimacy, and now increasingly out of diplomatic protection. And when Cuba finally turns, it will not just be a Caribbean story, it'll be a Western Hemisphere story. It'll be a China story, it'll be a Russia story, and it'll be an ANC story. It will be a story about the collapse of the anti-Western fantasy that has poisoned so many countries, including our own. The future belongs to nations that build, trade, innovate, produce, defend their borders, and tell the truth about socialism. Cuba did none of that. And now the bill is due. Trump is not merely playing defense. He's shaping the whole board. Venezuela first, Cuba next, China forced back to the table. America is back in command. And the ANC? They should watch carefully, because history is moving again, and it's not moving in their direction.